Okay. So I don't know if you guys remember, but I've been telling this story about, well, okay, this begins with finding a book, this landmark book. It's like if you were a 10-year-old kid, if you were in the 5th grade in 1950, and you had to do a book report, you would go to the library and get one of these things called a landmark book. And it's kind of weird American propaganda, but they're great, like, readers of American history. And I've been finding these on my walks through New York, and people put them out on the stoop. And I found one on the Mormons, and it's like the coming of the Mormons, and it talks about the sort of why they ended up in Salt Lake City. But and I remember a story that my family tells about a group that left North Carolina and went west with the Mormons. And I was just like, oh, I have a personal connection. And I started thinking about, genealogy and how sort of kind of, I don't know, lame it is until you start thinking of it as a network, as a really super important network. I also saw Benjamin Button. I should keep an eye on the time here. I'm going to give myself three minutes. I saw Benjamin Button, and I don't know if you guys know the story. It is it's this weird science fiction, but it's big name, won Oscars and stuff. But a person is born as an old man, so he's in a 80-year-old body, and he's a 5-year-old kid. And then he grows up until where he grows backwards until he's eventually a baby, at the 80th year of his life. And so it got me thinking about how to engage in a network, just thinking about our theme, and like what makes an impact network and how we spend our time. It's super important, those early childhood years. I thought about, and now this is and I've been using ChatGPT quite a bit. I just started a new project and have been sort of working on all of this. One of the cool things is it's like, okay, I can use this as a mermaid diagram of a family tree. It thinks I was born in 1990, but it's not. And what I wanted to get to was, again, with the Mormons. And then I don't know if you guys, Jeremy, I saw it reminded me of our Morkborg game sessions, which was going on about this time last year. I found a TV show called American Primeval. I was telling this story to a friend. He's like, oh, if you're interested in the Mormons, then you've got to check out American Primeval. And it is full on American Morkborg. One of the things is the native population have this, and it comes from the Iroquois Confederacy, this idea of the 7 generations. So you get this, you at the present, and then 7 generations back, so 7 fathers or mothers back. And what would that look like? So before I went into sort of programming, I got into a spreadsheet. So here I am in this last little minute here. Here I am. I was born in 1972. If my dad had me when he was 28 years old, so he was born in 1943. And if everybody, these numbers are going to be way off, because my great grandfather, I think he was born pretty close to 1888. That's the guy I was named for, Newman Potts. And so my 7th generation will be right around the American Revolution time, when that guy was born. or that mother was born. So if and I just thought about like all of the life stages, like your early childhood, 5 or 6, when you're coming out of like becoming verbal, like that grandfather from 1776 was in 1781, was 5 years old. And this is where they were at each epoch of their life. So I'm in around this 55 years. So in 1943, my great grandfather would have been about 55 years old, which blows my mind that he was about my age during World War II. And I made this calculable and whatnot, but so you've got these people in an important network that are related to you, and then they also have this context that we can work with, and some of the context we know, like the times of great wars, but what was the popular song when my dad was 13, 1956, 1936, when my grandfather was 13. Like, this was all of the puberty years, and then you can also extract this out into the future. Anyway, so that's like 6.5 minutes of families as networks. I'll stop sharing I'll stop sharing my screen, and then open it up to questions. Are you all? I do have some questions. Are you all interested in this? Can you, there's a couple of things that might be interesting to the group. One is the visualization and doing different visualization stuff. Another thing is this 7th generation Native American stuff. I guess it does come from the Iroquois Confederacy. And do we think about in sociocracy making decisions from the perspective of 7 years prior and 7 years hence? So I'm ready to answer questions or start a discussion. Oh, I'm looking at the chat, and yes, those are the landmark series from the Wikipedia. And I want to show you, Wikipedia also has great, let me present the screen. Wikipedia also has a pretty cool way to, like, if you do just this, 1915. Yeah. So you can just by the URL, you can see, and if you use this with this, and you say, okay, like this guy, Newman Potts, about that. So when he was 13, it was 1901, like what was going on in 1901? And you can also change the, because I know he was in rural North Carolina, so you could also sort of look for like what was going on in the United States. Or I think he really liked wrestling, so like when did like wrestling happen? Anyway, there you go. That's my topic. Yeah. Jeremy.
So, a few thoughts. First of all, like, you brought up the family tree, and it's so funny because my daughter and I just started playing this game called The Root Trees Are Dead, and it's like a detective story where you have to work out the family tree of like this billionaire that his whole family died and is leaving the money behind. And it's crazy because you get like a 1990s computer on a desk, and you get to do old web searches on Netscape, and you have to use a dial-up connection to do anything, and it's pretty cool how immersive it is. But it highlights this idea of the clues are not written down for you as a genealogy record, right? You have to search and find out what all these people did, who they talked to. It's really about surfacing a much wider network than just the family tree, and using that to inform this one specific source of inquiry that you're doing. And so it's really interesting. And it does highlight family tree as a type of network. Now it's especially if you stop looking at it as a branched linear thing, right? Which is what we're tempted to do. You could introduce all sorts of interesting things to that, like a mother doesn't take the name of her husband, right? And suddenly the tracking down the information gets a lot harder, right? Because you don't have that sudden conversion. Or in cases where she did change her name, the information is hidden now because she had another name that isn't in the map anymore. So it's like linear in a sense, but once you expand your context a little bit, you realize you're describing a very specific subset of a much wider network. And that's what we mean when we say like family tree. Second, I thought it was interesting that that you brought up that 7 generations thing, because there's a sort of a common, I don't know what you'd call it, a trope maybe, where it takes 7 years to master something. And
right.
There's a thought that if you have 7 generations of family, 7 generations of tribe, 7 generations of organization trying to do something, that maybe that many iterations is kind of how many it takes before they can say, hey, we got to the bottom of it. Like we need that much time to get there. And it's an interesting thing, because if you start looking at where humans get this number 7 iconography from, you can see it's in religion, it's in astrology, it's in some fundamental physical laws that we found. It has a lot to do with the way nerve dendrites form in the brain. They're based on like a code of 7 acids of some kind. And so you see this fractal drilling down process, and I think you just kind of went up, past the level of where we typically look, and you see, hey, as groups, we tend to think in terms of 7 as well. Across time, we tend to think in terms of 7. And I suspect, because it's my first encounter with 7 as special was in epistemology, where they talked about the crow epistemology, where you can only hold so many things in your conscious awareness at once, and certain factors like IQ can push that up, and then other factors like environmental suppression can push that down, but that the basic number kind of comes in right around 7, which is also reflected in Dunning-Kruger data and stuff like that. So I think it's a pretty solid entry point, right? To start thinking about it is, how can you use 7 levels of participation? How can you use 7 nodes on a map, right? To try and how federated do you need problem solving to be in a network before you start seeing results?
Yeah. I thought of it, and the for me that is it's the visualization part. Like that, it kind of came to me in that tree structure, that it was like the 7, like 7 generations, and that each of these generations, generally 3 generations, are walking around on Earth at the same time. And I don't know if you guys watched the Asimov Foundation series. They had the dawn, day, and dusk, and which were these cloned leader empire, what do you call this? Emperors. Um, I think for networkiness, I think that does anybody resonate with like these networks are your like original source networks, like in that, like having to roll through, like that's where we get all of our habits. I mean, and I'm not a specialist in anything, but also cultural context, like looking at all these folks with different, I was explaining it to Harsha, and he's just like, this is all Western, man. We we do it in a different way. And but having some empathy, sympathy with folks, that were, in this migration, that were migrating west, and the things that they encountered or how they did it. For instance, I'm now in New York City, and most of my family's from the Southeast. I was like, did they come this way to catch the train and go west? Like, where were the lines of communication and travel? And what did they encounter? And thinking about it in the term of a network, I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah. So what you just described there sounds like 7 levels of context to reframe any experience. So if you're a child, the experience of your elders can help you frame what you're experiencing, right? Because you only have your context, but they have their context, and family is this pre-existing set of connections that gives you access to those through, and then if you expand that out a little bit wider to like elders in a tribe or something like that, you actually have a cultural memory, right? So all the elders contribute to like seventh horizon thinking, and then you've got your very young people who are first horizon thinking, and or maybe it's the other way around, and so you get 7 different like pasts, 7 different horizons, like dawn horizons, but you also have 7 different visions of the future, like 7 different sunset horizons or future horizons, like what's out in front of you. That's that. And we know that if you were that by moving perspective around, it can help you clarify your thinking on lots of stuff. It's that synthesis idea. If if somebody says centralization and somebody else says decentralization, and then they're loggerheads battling each other, trying to figure it out. If somebody on the outside is able to look at both viewpoints and say, hey, some point between centralization and decentralization, like this is a polarity upon which we can move. We don't have to be on either end of it, fighting the other end. We can be somewhere on it, experiencing what we need to experience that we get from this concept. So 7 horizons, that's like really pushing it. Like that's essentially you're saying you're maxing out human capacity, right?
Yeah.
And 7's a lot.
Yeah, it's true. Well, I mean, if you look at that spreadsheet, if your parents are having children later, I mean, it goes all the way back to the 18th century. You skip a whole century. The generations get shorter if they have a baby younger. But it appears that mine were they were older. Yeah.
We rarely think in terms of those really long time frames. The one time where I personally was blown away was I was at our Zen center, and we were chanting the lineage starting at Shakyamuni Buddha, and then I went 23 transmissions from Buddha to his disciple to their disciple, all the way down 23 generations until it hopped over to China. And then in China, it spent 23 generations. And then it hopped to Japan, and there were 23 generations. And just thinking how deep that history went of teacher to pupil, 23 times in each country before it came to North America with my current teacher. And I couldn't even fathom that kind of time span, because that's 2,000 years or more. And
this is the Buddhist lineage?
Yeah, it was the Buddhist lineage.
I've noticed the Buddhism has kind of a penchant for numbers. I have a suspicion whether 23 is coincidence or just like backdating, crafting the lineage to be numerologically satisfying. Sorry, Shaggy, I think I was talking over you.
Oh, you're good. I mean, I think that was good input. I think me and Jeremy are kind of starting a sidebar conversation about how, at least in America, it's a lot more challenging, I think. The genealogy stuff is something I've worked on with my grandmother on my father's side. My mother's side actually has a much better genealogy, and I think that's largely attributed to the Jewish background they had, and that kind of was passed on heavily. And like we knew everyone in the line, they could trace it all the way back to like Levi, right? So And at least that's what they say they can do, right? But for my father's side, as soon as we get to the boats across the Atlantic, that's it. Like, good luck. And I think that's a pretty common theme here. And I wonder if our society, kind of like Jeremy said, it's a uniquely human issue. But in America, we don't tend to at least hold on tightly to those family connections for whatever reason. I wonder if that's kind of a social, if there are social symptoms of that.
Yeah, here's one framework for looking at that. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying it's a possible framework. You can look at the American experiment in like a disruptor type way, and the disruptors in most models, like economic models, are like entrepreneurs who come up with the big idea to move us into the future, and that business eventually dies out, but there's something else that it's pushing ahead, and eventually that becomes the paradigm that everybody experiences. There's a couple of people pushing something for the internet, and then eventually the internet's part of all of our lives, but those original pushers, they're gone. Like, their companies are dead. Occasionally you find some unicorn type stories like Microsoft or something, but even that's a little bit different. Go ahead.
Nice. Yeah.
Something else I think is important to note: when my mother and father got married, my mother, I think her strong ties to her family tree and her family line, that's why they hyphenated their name. She didn't give up her last name, and I think that would probably be more prevalent in the States if we saw more of that. She's attributed it directly to that in the past when I've asked her, like, why didn't you? Well, I knew who I came from and I'm proud of it. And my father couldn't have cared less, He didn't really have that same connection, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's totally true. So there's it's a very Western thing, this whole taking a name. And I don't know why there was this, and that's very, it works towards orthodoxy, right? It's a push towards an orthodox way of thinking, like we're reducing to a common denominator somewhere in the future, which is a very odd way of saying it, because the actual thing is expanding massively with every new generation. The DNA profile is expanding massively for every generation. And there's some cultures, like there's indigenous cultures here in the Northwest who, they have their whole family lineage in their name. It's like pre-programmed in there with a bunch of concepts. I know there's some tribes around here who keep family totem, and it's a stack of the stories of their family. It's not even their names. It's just the story that their family was telling over time. And there's histories of embellishment there, and there's history of power and everything else. And so it's a really interesting sort of measuring stick for what you're trying to measure. You have to ask yourself that sometimes, but still really super interesting to think about the limits we've placed on ourselves with just a standard convention that we all took for granted.
So,
Jeremy, I really appreciated. Oh, sorry, Newman.
Yeah. No, go ahead. But yeah, I'll take the stick in a second.
Jeremy, I really appreciated the place you started in. It felt like you were really looking for the connections to present day usefulness and finding where applicability was. And my question for Newman was, it almost sounded when you were telling about some of these things that you had some sort of parallel, almost like an allegory sort of mentality, where you were trying to, or where you're feeling a parallel to present day, the stuff that affects us here. And I'm really, really interested in, me.
I do. Yeah. I think that it goes to I think collective memory, or like the branches of a lineage, or because they split, they hard fork. The internet came about with a bunch of, there was some technology and some research, and there was idealism, and there was polarity and push and pull, and protocol wars, and war, conflict, and we went on a path. And now that we find ourselves in maybe a situation that we want to change things, or things need to be altered, like it seems like we could fall back on our network, or like our history, our lineage. Like you could go back and see where the lineage in a teaching, like in Zen Buddhism or Aikido or the other martial arts, and it's already there. There's knowledge that's there. It's just maybe dormant or latent, or like a history repeating itself is possibly on my mind, and like really like wanting to figure out what happened. Why did those folks leave? What challenges did they face when they did it? For instance, I told the story. Well, one, there's a lot of like religious. You guys haven't said anything bad about the Mormons, but there's a lot of like, oh, Mormons do this or Mormons do that. And I'm like, that's not really what this story is about. But I was telling the story, and my stepmom, her family, they also had a big group that went to that were going to Utah, and like a 10-year-old kid was just like, he got to as far as like St. Louis, and he's just like, nah, I don't think so. And he jumped off the train and ran back, and he eventually made his way all the way back to Georgia. And he became like the bottom of a totem, because there was a generation that left, and he was sort of in a special thing. So yes, I do think that the past and context can really inform the future, and that we have a built-in network for us. Yeah. Ken's got his hand up.
Yeah, like as far as putting it in a more modern, or like a context of networks, if you think about the way that we do like managing code or something, like if you're using version control, you're talking about having a history, and you're talking about being able to go back and look at that history, maybe pull something from there if you went down the wrong path. And so it's the sort of like looking at your heritage is sort of like version control for your own perspective of who you are.
I really like that. I really, really like that. And wouldn't it be cool if we had some tools that weren't, Ancestry, all this started because Ancestry.com, I couldn't get into my account. And I was like, let's see what ChatGPT would spit out. And that mermaid really made it pretty cool. But I hadn't thought of it in terms of a version control system. And the more media that we create, because I can't go back and read the firsthand account of that kid who jumped off the train and came back to Georgia. I mean, I know there's stories written about him, and there's there's from the North Carolina group, they came back. There was a group of them because they left in the year 1900, and in the 50s, a group of them came back, and there's a newspaper article, but it doesn't say much. Was anybody taking notes? Was there a Gemini note taker there at the picnic that day when the reporter and the photographer were there? Not for them, but certainly for us. And I wonder about, because I really am focused on documentation and those type of visualizations and communication, and this history, communal knowledge that we gets passed on in a way that doesn't narrow our path but widens and gives us opportunity. Nori, see your hands up.
Yeah, just thinking about the documentation and how it's really hard to trace your family tree if you don't know beyond when records were kept. Like you can go to ancestry.org or familysearch.org, or all these places where they have tons of documents and immigration and ship manifests and things that you can find names as people came into North America. But you can't go much further back than that. And just relating it back to our networkiness, that is like, what kind of information should we be leaving behind ourselves so that we can say there was an ODIN meeting and Shaggy was there, so that you know that these connections were made between our social network here, and being able to figure that out later to say, how big is this network, or who's connected to who, or like some of those things the ecosystem mapping group might help with. But I'm wondering if there's a more powerful way of just mapping that field that we're building and kind of visualize it in some way and leave that for later generations to look at and say, oh, these people came together here and worked on these things.
Thank you.
Yeah, the
I wanted real
field.
quick-
Yep. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I want to touch on something Ken had mentioned. That ability to go and like reboot, right? Like, I guess like go get in touch with the roots. In my dad's side of the family, I got to learn why he does it, right? He had some slimy family members. Like there was a whole mob group in St. Louis and everything. And, you know, in my early 20s, one of the first things I did was go out there to see like their warehouse and everything. It's the last building that's still standing from all that. And I don't know, there's a lot of power in doing that, but it also sometimes like that connection isn't good, right? So I think there, you know, in America at least, we probably see a lot of need to be able to reboot. I've got friends who got to have similar experiences like in Jamestown, and they, you know, they were able to trace their lineage all the way back to Jamestown, the original Jamestown. And there's a wonderful historical museum and everything out there in Virginia where they've rebuilt essentially like the historically accurate Jamestown. It's just, I don't know. Almost to Nori's point, my idea was always very antiquated. Like if I want to leave a legacy, I'm going to try and get enough money to fund a library to be built in my hometown, and then have that named after my dad or something. You know, like, I don't know. It's not something I've ever pondered too deeply. You know, what archival references are we leaving behind? And I'm certain that the ones that I have so far are not necessarily the best. So I don't know, that ability to reboot gives me a little bit of hope and trying to figure out like, what's the legacy we want to leave behind, I guess.
Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
not just
Go ahead.
the information that we leave, it's also the causal impact. So like there's ways that our life affects other people, and you may not see the results of that anywhere in like the record, but it's still something that changes the way the course of history flows.
Yeah, like how many people attended Victor Hugo's funeral in France, right? Like he's somebody that, you know, he's well known for being a great artist, but at the same time, he deeply affected so many people that only had one outlet for truly showing that to him. You know, and that was to be there at that one singular celebratory event for him.
And it almost didn't happen. Wasn't
Right.
Victor Hugo exiled?
Yeah, or so many artists that you know, don't achieve fame. People don't quite understand them until they're long gone. You know, they get rediscovered.
Right. So how are those archived, right? Think about how do we even have their material? If it was dismissed at the time, how do we even have their material? Right. It was a handful of people who recognized it, a small handful that preserved it, that were like, no, this is special. And what was their criteria? What was their evaluative criteria for knowing it was special? It was tapping into some aspect of that culture and realizing, here's somebody talking about the future. I have to preserve this until the future gets here. There's so many great sci-fi stories that are built around, you know, this, you know, be ready for the future kind of a thing. Like, we're not building for now, we're building for 1,000 years in the future when we're exoplanetary and stuff like that. But yeah, same concept. It's obviously it's a deep question, like what's relevant, right? What's relevant? Because time is this liminal thing. It's this manifold thing. The past matters as much as the present matters as much as the future, and all three can be present in a single moment. So how do you decide which one of those is the determinant for relevance? And so that's where the network comes in. So Nori said earlier, 7's a big number, right? From the point of view of like keeping track of 7 broad contexts for how we process and evaluate information, 7's a big number. Like 3 is a big number. 3 is like considered comprehensive. Like if you've got 3 solutions to a problem, 3 perspectives on an issue, like people tend to think, well, that's pretty solid. Like that's a basis for solving. But 7 seems like overkill in a way. But who can process 7, right? It's difficult for an individual, but it's not difficult for a group. Cultures especially can process 7. It's really talking about group tooling, at this point. The network is obviously for and by a network, but the idea is an individual's only going to get so much out of that. They need to just engage with it in their own way and trust that the rest of the network is doing its thing. Right, that it's bringing relevance to their doorstep. This came up with the Now page, right? How do you determine which people to follow, which people to listen to? Your interests will change in 7 years, assuming you've mastered Catalyst to Cardano, whatever you're working on. You're going to move on to something else, probably. It's doubtful that any of the people I've met in these spaces who are thinking and moving through them, and not just looking for a place to park themselves for the rest of their lives, they're going to get to mastery. They're going to get to solving, and then they're going to move to something new. So how do we keep track of that? Who's relevant?
Yes. Then? Okay. You guys are crazy good. Because I did ask ChatGPT, and you're like the big network is working, because ChatGPT talks about how wisdom, influence, and relationship evolve across generations, which shape communities and decisions. So that, I think that really does sort of say like that there is there's cultural context that can be wide, like having different perspectives, 3, 7, 9, 12, 23, like there are these sort of interesting numbers as we climb the scale. But I think what I'm most interested in, and what I'll take away from this, is especially how the Now page, like that, and that's always been the visual, is that sort of the family tree that goes up and down. It's really, to me, it kind of goes side to side, so that path that funnels down to the present and then spreads out to the future, and that we have a special power, actually going back to Ken's thing, that it's like there's like a good chemical reaction that happens with information and power and ability, and Shaggy's sort of talking about how it like what and why you would try to like hang on to something, or sort of like say shut something down, that if that makes sense. But I do realize we're rolling up on time, so I want to sort of bring in some sort of finalizing thoughts, because this has been great. This might be a good one to re-listen to, and I think I want to continue on with this application. I'm really curious. I think it'll help me as I try to make sense of the previous epochs in my life. The early childhood, the adolescence, the adulthood, the middle age, and then hopefully the elder time. Like what did my lineage, what contexts and issues did they deal with? Did they leave anything behind? Can I glean something from their story that helps and informs my story? And then can I do anything now in the present that would help or inform or impact those future generations, future ancestors? Yeah, so thanks for listening. Thanks for the great conversation.
Nice. Thank you, Newman.